ask you, do you believe this is the Word of God? Do you believe it's true? Do you believe it's historically accurate, reliable? Why?
Good question. Join Dr. Bo Kirkwood as he reviews the evidences from McDowell's book and anchors our faith in God's book. Now, Dr. Bo Kirkwood.
Okay, so tonight we're continuing our discussion on worldviews. And it dawned on me maybe I should explain a little bit what we mean by what a worldview is. Like I said last week, everybody in the world really has a worldview, whether they can tell you what that worldview is or even know that they've got a worldview. They really do. A worldview is just the way that you look at the world. You know, where does that person come from? Where do you come from? And last week we started out, well, for example, let me just say this. Well, you know, I think most people in this class would probably have the same worldview that I have. And that is that there's ample evidence for a creator in our universe. There's ample evidence of an intelligent designer of the universe. There's ample evidence, and that's what this class is about, that person is the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament that we have in our Bibles. There's ample evidence to show that he's communicated to us through that word. That's my worldview. And we're showing evidence. We did classes already on the creation and evolution to, I think, totally show that there has to be an intelligent designer of where we're at in the universe, and I think that's real obvious. So now what we're doing is we're looking at the evidence that he's communicated to us, in this case through the Bible. That's my worldview. Hopefully it's the worldview of everybody in this class, but understand that the majority of the world doesn't have the same worldview that you and I have. Why does it make a difference? Because when you're trying to convict that person, when you're trying to instruct that person, it's helpful to know where their worldview is. And there's going to be some who's going to be a little bit more difficult to convict, a little bit more difficult to convert, depending on what their worldview is. But you kind of need to know it. And when you ask them, if you ask them what your worldview is, they'll say, "What are you talking about?" They're not going to know what that is. But if you ask them, "What's your philosophy of life?" Maybe that's a good way of putting it. Then you can discern what their worldview is. And sometimes there's a mixture. You know, postmodernism, there may be some Eastern mystical worldview that overlaps a little bit. They don't have to be exactly the same. But last week we started the discussion by looking at postmodernism. And again, do you remember the key thing to remember about postmodernism? What's that? Truth is relative. If you don't remember anything else about postmodernism, that's it. In just real simplistic terms, truth is relative. That you cannot know the truth. The truth for you may be truth for you, but it ain't true for me. And of course, that's just an absolute absurdity. Truth is truth. Whether you believe it or not, whether you accept it or not, it's still the truth. Whether you accept the world is round and is a sphere is true, whether you believe it or not. You may think it's flat, but there's pretty good evidence to show that it's not, but it's still true. And just because the majority of people believe something does not make it true by any stretch of the imagination. Because once again, referring back to the flat earth concept, the majority of the world for centuries believed that the earth was flat. You know, that's what they believed. Were they right? Well, of course not, they weren't right, but they believed it, but it wasn't the truth. And it wasn't just truth for them. It was not true, period, any way, shape, or form. So we're going to look at a few more of the worldviews that are popular out there today and talk about them very briefly. And then we will be getting into your first lesson, which is evidences as far as the uniqueness of the Bible. And we'll be getting into that tonight as well. And talk about, probably won't finish that tonight. In fact, I'm certain we won't, but we'll be talking about that. So what's another worldview? Another worldview is referred to as Eastern mystical, the mystics. So what's peculiar about the mystics? The mystics are kind of the other kind of mystical. That's right. The mystics are kind of mystical, in that it's sort of like postmodernism in a way. You know, what you believe is fine, what I believe is fine, but it's really more based upon a feeling than any really hard substance, anything that you can show. So Norm Anderson put it in this term: in general terms, mysticism represents the belief that direct knowledge of God, a spiritual truth of ultimate reality, is attainable through immediate intuition or insight in a way different from the ordinary sense, perception, or the use of logical reasoning. In other words, it's totally opposite of what we're teaching in this class. We're teaching in this class that you can know about God if you just use logic. The mystics, they kind of throw logic out the door. It's a knowledge. It's something that you attain to, but you attain to it not through the reading of any doctrine or word, but it's more of an intuition or how you feel. Who do you think of in our New Testament who were mystics that the writer of 1st and 2nd John, 3rd John wrote about? Who were they? Yeah, the Gnostics. The Gnostics were a mystical religion, and they tried to bring that mysticism into Christianity. So the Gnostics believed that you attain gnosis, that's the word, where they get the name Gnostics, and that word simply means knowledge. And the way you achieved that knowledge was through insight. It was something that you kind of, I guess if you did enough thinking, what the Gnostics weren't real good about is telling you exactly how to get that, by the way. You know, in our terms today, it's better felt than told kind of thing. But you could achieve it, but exactly how you went about achieving it, they weren't real good at telling you. But once you achieved that gnosis, you had this special knowledge, this special intuition. They brought that over into Christianity, but where do you think Gnosticism came from? There's plenty of evidence to show that Gnosticism came from the Far East, from the Buddhists, which was around already during Christ's time, by the way. Those mystics were already around. They were over in India and places like that. They brought that into a previous concept of Gnosticism, which has its own unique theology, by the way, which is very bizarre, which we won't really get into at this point. But they borrowed from the mystics. They borrowed from Christianity, and the writer of John, probably the Apostle John, was probably talking about the Gnostics in those books, and that's where they came from. And they were already dealing with that apostasy at that point in time. But that's what mysticism is. So the most popular mystics that we know today is Buddhism. Buddhism is Gnosticism, not Gnosticism, but it's mystical. It's kind of achieving nirvana. You heard that term, nirvana? And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to become one with the world. And it's very popular, and it's not one of logic. It's not one of reason. In fact, as we say here, it is the antithesis of it. It's the exact opposite of that. And there's obviously others as well, but that's probably the most popular. And does it permeate our society today? Oh, yes, it does. And some people, when they say, I'm spiritual, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a mystical thing. I have this feeling of spirituality, not what you and I might think of as spiritual. In fact, Jerry mentioned that in his lesson last week. So one has difficulty, if one has difficulty accepting the laws of logic, the individual has problems when looking at the evidence. They're going to be a hard person to convert, aren't they? Because it's not based on knowledge and reason. And so evidence doesn't mean anything to them. It's not going to have a lot of meaning. I don't care. This is how I feel. This is what I think. So logic demands an either-or approach, right? When you're trying to do something, it's either this or it's something else. The mystics, it's both and. Oh, it could be both that. Or it could be this and that. And that's very non-logical, if you will. That's mysticism in a nutshell. And there are people, millions and millions of people across the world, that this is their worldview. And that's why they're sort of easy to get along with, you know, because it's not an either or, it's yours, mine, both, doesn't matter. Norman Geisler said, if pantheists actually lived out their pantheism consistently, would there be any pantheists left? I mean, let's face it, gravity's not an either or. I mean, it's not a both and, it's an either or. It's either there or it's not. If you were living in a both and, you wouldn't survive very long. How about the atheist? The atheistic world. Well, that's pretty obvious, but the atheists have their own worldview. And what do they say? Well, there's no God. That's what we're dealing with. And there's atheism. When I was a young man, you know, you hardly knew of any atheists. Now, you probably personally know atheists yourself. And it's a fairly popular worldview. And it is the most popular worldview of our naturalists. Those people like Charles Dawkins and people of that nature who believe that evolution is true and that molecules to man evolution is true, and all of that we have in our world today came about through purely naturalistic means, most of those people would fall into the atheistic worldview. And if there's no God, though, to me, this is a sad group of people to me. To me, it's just utterly sad to believe there is no God, because they have no hope for the future. The future is dim for themselves and society, and as man is really left to do as he pleases. And so this goes back to, again, a little bit of overlap between this and postmodernism. There's a little bit of overlap there with the postmodernists, because they all believe that society makes their own rules, and why not? There's no higher order. They can't really give you a good explanation of exactly how those rules came down, and I believe we wouldn't have those rules if it wasn't for God delineating those rules to us. And most atheists, this is according to Josh McDowell in his book, and I'm not sure if you would agree with this or not, but I believe in general it's sort of true, and that is most atheists live a rather dreadful life, and frequently at their deathbed renounce their belief, because I think deep down inside, even the atheist wants to believe that there's something besides what we have here on this life. I think even the atheist deep down wants to believe that. Because to me, the saddest concept at all is that it's a one and done thing. We're here and then we're gone. Makes no sense of the meaning of life to me. And atheists are never really likely to significantly examine the evidence for God, and certainly for not Jesus Christ. They're just not likely to do it. It's impossible. They're just not likely to do it. But there are examples of atheists that eventually turn to God and become Christians. But it's a very, very difficult group to try to convert if they can't start off believing there's a God. And that's what our first series of lessons was really all about, trying to convince someone that there has to be more to life than everything occurring naturalistic. How about the agnostic world? What are agnostics? Anyone want to describe or define an agnostic to me? David?
They say that you cannot know whether or not there's God.
That's right. So they have it's kind of like I'm sitting on this fence post. I'm not going to say there's no God, but I'm just going to say you can't know it. There's actually two different types. But for sure the agnostic is unsure if there is a God. They won't go so far as to say there's not. But like I said, there's two groups. One is what David just described, and that's the one that says it's impossible to know. So they will be agnostic forever, because they say you cannot know. It's impossible to know whether or not there's a God. But there's the other agnostics that says, well, really, we just don't have any knowledge there's a God. They wouldn't say it's impossible, but they would say we just don't have any knowledge to prove it or not. That's a little bit different. Sounds like the same, but it's a little bit different. Nonetheless, the agnostics just are unsure if there's a God. To me, it's like either believe there's a God or not. The agnostics I actually have probably the most problem with, because the evidence, as we stated, is all around that there is a creator. It's all around us. But to just say you don't have evidence, you have no knowledge there's a God, they're without excuse. That's what Paul said in the book of Romans. They're without an excuse. But it is a worldview. And again, it goes back to postmodernism. All knowledge about reality, truth is impossible. You can't really know the truth. But that statement in itself is an absurdity, because you're making a statement that can't be true then. And then there's the materialistic or naturalistic world, which again, there's overlap between this and the atheist. Then they say that naturalism is the order of the day, and that's their worldview, and that say the universe, hence life, is purely the result of naturalistic random forces. There cannot be any room at all for the supernatural. And so therefore it has to be naturalistic. Why do most people believe in evolution? Because it is the only naturalistic theory really that's out there as to how life began. It's the only one. Why is creationism not taught in our public schools? Because it's not naturalistic, okay? It's not a natural explanation of the world. It invokes the supernatural. Now, I was listening to someone on the radio the other day, and this sort of makes sense to me, but when you've You shouldn't accept the unnatural when the natural is a better explanation for something. Isn't that true? How could we live our lives otherwise if we thought everything was supernatural? So when there's a natural explanation for something, that's the explanation you should be looking for in life if you're going to live a quote-unquote normal life. But there are some things that defy the natural, and I would say the universe is one of those. It defies the natural. There's people say, well, it all started with a Big Bang. What banged? If you have a Big Bang, something had to have banged, right? If the universe was wrapped up in something so infinitesimal that you couldn't see it, yet it had more gravity than you could possibly imagine, that means there was still something there to begin with. So something had to have banged. That's not an explanation at all. It really isn't. That's naturalism. But that's why most of your scientists are believers in evolution. Not all of them. There's a lot that aren't. There's a whole lot that aren't. But it's because it's the only naturalistic theory out there. So try to get creationism taught in the public school. You can't do it. You can't even mention it because it's not naturalistic. It's not scientific. That's not true. It is scientific. It's just a different scientific way of explaining our universe. And as Josh McDowell says in the book, and I agree with this, it's interesting, it's kind of ironic. What gives us the most evidence that there's a God? It comes from the scientific world. The more you study the universe, the more you study the human body, that actually gives you more evidence for a creator. That's why I'm not afraid of looking at that stuff, and you shouldn't be either. The evidence that we find from science actually gives us more evidence that there is a God. So it's, to me, sort of ironic. But there's just, like I said, there's a lot of very, very smart, intelligent people, scientists in the world that aren't naturalists. There aren't. So the idea that everyone is not true. And the fact of the matter is, most scientists that are not in their own sphere of study, let's say they're physicists, they're not biologists, they're certainly not anthropologists or people that would study evolution per se. They accept evolution, but they haven't really studied it. Because I think if the pure scientists studied it, they would understand what you and I came to understand, and that is evolution is strictly a philosophy. It's not science at all. And I give an example here, and that's there's just the DNA molecule itself. When we studied that molecule in our last classes, we noticed that how proteins are made. They're made through the DNA molecule. Well, something had to make the DNA molecule to begin with, but it's the code for our proteins. Every amino acid is coded by 3 codons on the DNA chain. That's how proteins are made. It's unlikely, virtually impossible, that you could build a protein by just random naturalistic processes. And it is the language of God. So living systems could not have been generated by random processes within a finite time scale in a finite universe. I would say they couldn't do it in an infinite time scale, but they certainly couldn't do it in an infinite time scale. And even every cosmologist that I know of believes that there was some finite time scale involved with our universe. How old do they say the universe is? 13.7 billion years, thereabouts. Well, that's finite. It's a long time, but it is finite. Now, how do they get around that? Because they even understand that now. They understand that time scale is not long enough. So how do they get around it? You remember my class. Multi-universe. There's been multi-universes. Then there's been an infinite number of universes. And that's totally philosophical because there's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. We know that the universe is finely tuned from the size of the electron to the speed of light to allow for the development of life. There are many, many, many constants that have to be what they are for you and I to be here today. And this requires these many constants to be here, and it is exceedingly unlikely all the world would have come about by pure chance. So what's the conclusion as far as this part of the class is concerned? David Hume, many years ago, a Scottish philosopher back in the 1700s, in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, this is a famous quote. He says, if we take in hand any volume, and he's talking about religious volume here, any volume, a divinity or school of metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quality or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact or existence? No. Commit it to flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. And the vast religious books of the world today would fit in that category. Read some of the Hindu writings. Read some of the Buddhist writings. Read the Book of Mormon. Read the book, the Quran. They would fit in that category. The Bible does not. It is a logic. It's a faith based upon logic. It doesn't fit that category. And David Hume apparently, well, maybe didn't want to read it and understand it. But the Bible transcends this. B.C. Johnson, in the Atheist Debater's Handbook, said, if God exists, there will be evidence for this. Signs will emerge which point to such a conclusion. Yes, they do. And yes, there are. And there are many of them. And finally, McDowell says, the evidence has, in fact, emerged in so specific a way that it's clear God wants us to know more than he simply exists. He wants to know that we can know him. The essence of this class and why my worldview is what it is. So now we're going to go into a different topic. This will be your introduction. If you got your books, you can follow this along. We will not finish this today. Virtually can assure you of that. And we'll pick it up again next week. But for our next week, I would want you to read the second chapter as well. And the second chapter is going to be looking at how we got the Bible. Very important, because the Bible just didn't come down from heaven, and it didn't happen that way. It got here through a process. We shouldn't be afraid to look at that process, because someone is going to point out to you how you got the Bible, and I think you need to know that. You need to have some information. That's what we're going to look at probably starting next week. But this week we're going to start off by looking at the uniqueness of the Bible. Now, I asked a question last week, and hopefully you remember the answer. But does the uniqueness of the Bible prove the inspiration of the Bible? No, it does not. So why are we even looking at it? Because it's part of the evidence. If you've got a book that's the most unique book in the world, which I clearly believe it is, and this is going to show it, then maybe there's something to it. But in and of itself, uniqueness does not prove the inspiration of the Bible, but it sure lends a lot of solid evidence that there may be something very, very special about it. I'm not talking about the prophecies themselves. Different subject, we're going to talk about those later. I think they do prove the inspiration of the Bible. But we're looking at just the uniqueness of the Bible as a whole. And we'll mention prophecy a little bit. And the Bible stands alone amongst all the books in its uniqueness. There is no other so-called holy book that even compares to it. And if you haven't read some of these other books, or at least portions of them, it might be good to read them, because you'd understand what I'm saying if you did. So let's look at a few things that make the Bible so unique. And one is its continuity. You have a book that's been written over 15 years. It took over 1,500 years to write. I don't know of any book that's taken over 1,500 years to write. There may be, but I don't know it. But our Bible, beginning with Genesis through the end of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, I'm concluding that in our Bible, New and Old Testament. It took over 1,500 years to write. That's a lot of continuity. It was written by over 40 authors. And these authors came from all forms of walks of life, from kings to military leaders to peasants to philosophers, fishermen, tax collectors, poets, musicians, statesmen, scholars, and shepherds. For example, Moses. Now this is Josh McDowell's language, so I'm talking how he describes Moses here. But he says he's a political leader and judge trained in the University of Egypt. I didn't know there was a University of Egypt, but we understand what he's talking about. He was trained in Egypt, and that's McDowell calling it that, but I'm pretty sure there wasn't something called the University of Egypt when he was there. But we get it. We get where he came from. He was a Jew, but he was trained in the courts of Pharaoh, wasn't he? And then you have someone like David. And David began his life as a shepherd boy, didn't he? He had no aspirations to become king. I don't think he did. I don't read where he did. It was sort of thrust on him a little bit. But yet he eventually became a valiant warrior. He was a musician and a poet. A lot of your psalms are written by David, and he eventually did become a king. Amos was a herdsman. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Joshua was a military general. Nehemiah was a cupbearer for a pagan king. Daniel he calls him a prime minister. That's probably a good description of him. Again, the Bible doesn't use that term, but it kind of fits what he became second in command, didn't he? Solomon, king and philosopher. Luke was a physician, and he was a historian too, because he wrote a large part of our New Testament, book of Luke and Acts. Peter was a fisherman. You all know this. Matthew, tax collector. Paul, he calls him a rabbi. Again, I don't think the Bible refers to Paul as a rabbi, but probably a decent description of what Paul was before he became a Christian. And Mark he calls Peter secretary. Okay, John Mark followed Peter around and was sort of his secretary. So it was also written, this is still continuing with its continuity there, written in different places. Moses wrote it in the wilderness. Jeremiah was in a dungeon. Daniel was on a hillside and in a palace when he wrote his. Paul wrote some of his epistles from inside prison. Luke was writing while he was traveling probably. John wrote the book of Revelation when he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos. It was written at different times. Now, not just over 1,500 years, but different times historically. So David wrote some of his Psalms during times of war and sacrifice. Solomon wrote his during times of peace and prosperity. So it wasn't just during war and sacrifice. Solomon wrote his during peace and prosperity. Written during different moods. Some writing from the heights of joy, other writings from the depths of sorrow and despair. Some during times of certainty and conviction, and others during days of confusion or doubt. Just again showing the continuity of the book. Written on 3 different continents. Written in Asia, Africa, and Europe. What we know of Europe, what we call Europe today. Written in 3 languages. I think, again, most of you know this stuff, but it just, for those that don't, it's interesting to look at it. Hebrew was the language of the Israelites, and that's the language of most of your Old Testament. It was written in Hebrew. It was called the language of Judah in 2 Kings 18, 21 through 28, 26 through 28, and Nehemiah, and it was called the language of Canaan in Isaiah 19:18. But the Hebrew language, by far, the vast majority of your Old Testament was written in Hebrew. But part of the Old Testament was also written in Aramaic. We see that in the book of Daniel, Daniel's chapters 2 through 7, and then Ezra, most of Ezra, and then it was written in Aramaic through 7. And then, of course, your New Testament was written what? It was written in Greek. What kind of Greek was it? Yeah, if you grew up in the church, you've heard this for all your life. It was the Koine Greek, which is common Greek. And the interesting thing about that language is it was a static language. It did not change over the centuries. Why is that important? Because people want to say, well, the words, what they meant back in the first century mean something totally different than what they mean now. And that's not true because that was a dead language. Different literary styles. You have poetry, you have historical narrative, you have song, you have romance, didactic treatises. And I'm sure when I'm reading all these, you're thinking of those books that are written like this. Personal correspondence, memoirs, satire, biography, autobiography, law, prophecy, parable, and allegory. All these different styles were written, the Bible's written into, or written from. It also addresses controversial subjects and quote-unquote hot topics, such as marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The Bible doesn't shy away from that. We read about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, especially in the New Testament. It deals with homosexuality, things that would not be popular to deal with today. It deals with the concept of adultery, obedience to authority, truth-telling and lying, character development, parenting, and the nature and revelation of God. So despite its diversity, there's a common theme. The Bible represents a single unifying story when you really think about it. And that's God's redemption of mankind. God's redemption of human beings. As Geisler and Nix point out, the paradise lost of Genesis becomes the paradise regained in Revelation, whereas the gate of the tree of life is closed in Genesis, it's reopened forever in the book of Revelation. And you don't think about that reading the Bible. That is the unifying theme of our Bible. The leading character is God, made known through Jesus Christ. The law provides the foundation. Again, I'm quoting now from Geisler and Nix. The law provides the foundation for Christ. The historical books show the preparation for Christ. The poetical works aspire to Christ. The prophecies display an expectation of Christ. The New Testament Gospels record the historical manifestation of Christ. The Acts relate the propagation of Christ. The apostles give the interpretation of him. And the revelation is found in the consummation of all things in Christ. So there is this great continuity and this great unifying thing. It's also very unique in its circulation. The circulation of the Bible is in the billions. No other book has known anything approaching the constant circulation of the Bible. You know, years ago, not too many years ago, y'all are familiar with the movie and the book, The Da Vinci Code. I wrote a book about that. And then I preached a sermon here about that as well. Well, at the time, the Da Vinci Code, that book was a literary phenomenon. No book of fiction had ever done anything like that book had done. I don't even know what the numbers are now, but when I did my research earlier at the time, it had already sold in the order of 33 million copies. That's a lot of books. My book didn't sell that much, by the way. But, but the Da Vinci Code sold 33 million copies at one time. And of course, it made Mr. Dan Brown a billionaire. That's with a B, not an M. They made him a billionaire. But did you know the only book during that time that outsold the Da Vinci Code? It was the Bible. Even during that time, there was more Bibles being sold on a yearly basis than any book, and it continues that way. There's no other books quite like that. No other books even approach it. It's unique in its translation. How many languages? Well, when McDowell wrote our book, The New Evidence, it was 2,200 languages. It's more than that now, but I don't know the exact figure, but it's at least 2,200 languages. Represents over 90% of the primary vehicle for communication in the world. I don't think even Dan Brown's book was translated in 2,200 languages. And interesting, the Old Testament was translated. In fact, the Old Testament was one of the very first books of antiquity to ever be translated. And it was translated into what? Greek. And what do we call that? The Septuagint. So it was translated into 250 BC. That means before Christ, obviously. Before Christ was around, the book of the Old Testament had already been translated into Greek. So when Christ was translating or was quoting from the Old Testament, he was quoting from the Septuagint. And did Christ accept the Old Testament as the Word of God? Well, of course he did. You don't, as far as proving the validity of the Old Testament, if I can prove that Jesus Christ was resurrected, I've got the validity of the Old Testament already, don't I? Because Christ himself said the Old Testament was the Word of God many times. How about its survival through a long period of time? It was written over 1,500 years ago. Parts of it written, well before the birth of Christ, and yet we still have it. It's still here, and it's unique in that way. Compared to other ancient writings, the Bible has more manuscript evidence to support it than any 10 pieces of classical literature combined. No other book like that. The textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material. This comes from Bruce Metzger, who's now passed away, but one of the most knowledgeable men on Bible evidences and how we got the Bible and Bible critics to ever live, Bruce Metzger. And there's an embarrassment of wealth compared to the other books of antiquity. And John Warwick Montgomery said that to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. What does he mean by that? That's a big statement, a lot of big words in there. What is he saying by that? What he's saying there is, you believe that Shakespeare's writings are real and that he really wrote those? Well, there's more evidence that the Bible's what is original than Shakespeare. And we could go back further than that. We can go back to Plato. You think there's a lot of extant works of Plato? No, there's a whole lot more for the Bible, a whole lot more. So if you're not going to believe the Bible is original and the work that it is, whether you believe it's from God or not, but not believe we have what was written, then you're going to have to throw away all these other books in antiquity and not believe them. That's what he's saying there, because the evidence is overwhelming. Uniqueness through persecution. Do you believe there's a lot of people that have tried to destroy the Bible? Well, of course there has been. and there still are. But it's withstood the attacks. The Bible has withstood these vicious attacks by its enemies. In fact, Diocletian in 303, what did he put out? He put out an edict to stop Christians from worshiping and to destroy their scriptures. That was 303 AD. Interestingly enough, just 25 years later, the Roman Emperor Constantine actually issued an edict to produce more Bibles. So it had flipped. So Diocletian wasn't very successful, was he? Even an emperor, even a Roman emperor came around later and copied. And that's where, by the way, Dan Brown gets his ideas that the Bible was written, during the time of Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. No, Constantine was already taking original Bibles that had already been written and was just making more copies of them, better copies to withstand time. Voltaire, who died many years ago, 1778, said that in 100 years from his time, Christianity would be swept from existence and passed into history. It's a fleeting thing. It's not going to be around very long. Ironically, again, only 50 years after his death, the Geneva Bible Society used his press and his house to produce stacks of Bibles. Voltaire was, I'd say he was wrong. How about uniqueness through criticism? Has the Bible been criticized? Oh yeah, over and over again. And we're going to look at that in great detail in this class. We're going to look at the criticism of the Bible because people say it's not the original words, we can't trust it, things like that. So this is from Bernard Ram. 1,000 times over, the death bell of the Bible has been sounded. The funeral processions from the inscription cut on the tombstones and the committal read, but somehow the corpse never stays put. Some have argued, for example, that the Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses because they didn't have written language back then. So how could Moses have possibly written the first 5 books of the Bible? Well, you ever heard of something called the Rosetta Stone? Well, it was written well before Moses, the Law of Hammurabi. And they had writing. It's written on stone. Some have argued there were no Hittites who lived during the time of Abraham. The Hittites were made up. There was no such group as the Hittites. That's been squelched many times over now. And actually, archaeological research has now uncovered evidence that the Hittites survived at least 1,200 years. And they were certainly around during Abraham's time. Nelson Glueck, noted biblical archaeologist, all I have ever said is that in all my archaeological investigation, I have never found one artifact of antiquity that contradicts any statement in the Word of God. And we will end there so that we can start this next topic. We're going to be looking at its uniqueness and its teachings. Again, finish reading the introduction if you didn't do that already, or the first chapter. We're in the first chapter now. And read the second chapter. We won't finish the second chapter, but be prepared. I think the class will be a lot more meaningful if you do that.